Welcome to our first episode of Keeping Up with Cleopatra, where we're going to look at the events of the life of Cleopatra, the last pharaoh of Egypt. Now, most of you are familiar with the name and probably with some elements of the story. However, when we look at the events of Cleopatra's life, what we see is that it is much, much more dramatic than what we often see depicted in fiction. It's more dramatic than reality television. We have sibling rivalry, betrayal, fights for power. We have children trying to overthrow their parents. We have betrayal. We have battles. We have fights for territory. We have love affairs and children who are either acknowledged or denied. Now, in Greek, they spell it Cleopatra with a K, which I think is very fitting for our title of our series. Here we have two depictions of Cleopatra. One, the left-hand one, is in the Egyptian style. We see her side on, it's very stylized, and she is presented showing us symbols of her as pharaoh. The picture on the right is showing her in a Greek style. It's 3D, it's much more realistic. And Cleopatra, although she was a pharaoh of Egypt, she was one of the Ptolemies, who were a Greek family who ruled Egypt for several hundred years. And the time frame we're going to look at goes from here, 332 BC, up until 30 BC. Now, our story is actually going to start with Alexander the Great. So, Alexander was a Macedonian who took over all of the Hellenic states and controlled them. He then invaded Turkey and then moved down to Egypt. And then after conquering Egypt, he sets off to conquer the rest of the known world at the time. One of the things we're going to keep coming back to is why everyone wanted Egypt. And what it comes down to is grain supplies. When the Nile flooded every year, it would deposit a whole lot of rich soil on the shores of the Nile and in the floodplains there. And then for the rest of the year, they could grow large amounts of grain. And everyone around the Mediterranean wanted that. So whoever had Egypt had control of a very large food supply, which was great for trade and for feeding armies and cities. So Alexander started up here in Macedonia. He came down here, conquers Egypt, founded a city, Alexandria, and then goes off here, and then he later dies. He actually founded a number of cities called Alexandria. It got to the point where there was 12 different cities called Alexandria. So they would then have little nicknames, Alexandria in Egypt, Alexandria over there. Yeah. Now, when Alexander dies, his generals divided up that territory between them. And Ptolemy Soter gets Egypt, and he is basically going to be what they called the satrap, the governor of that area. Now, Ptolemy had actually been a long time companion of Alexander. He'd been educated with him, he'd served with him as one of his companions for many years. After Alexander dies, Ptolemy puts out a rumour that they were actually half-brothers. This is probably not true, but he was doing that to add legitimacy to his claims for control of Egypt. After a number of years as the governor, he says, "Ugh," and just declares himself the pharaoh, the ruler. And in order to make himself more popular with the local Egyptian people, he adopts their titles and customs. So although he was originally from Greece, he blends that together with the local Egyptian customs. So here we can see a, a statue of him in the Greek style, and then a depiction of him in the Egyptian style, where we have that profile, that very stylized depiction. And in fact, he's giving an offering to Hathor, one of the Egyptian gods. So he is really trying to appeal to the local Egyptian people. So the next couple of hundred years are referred to as the Ptolemaic era because his descendants ruled Egypt, and they basically blended together their Greek origins and history with the Egyptian customs. Here we've got a family tree leading to Cleopatra here, Cleopatra 7th. Up here we have Ptolemy Soter. And we can see that in the intervening generations, they have a lot of those consanguineous marriages, which the Egyptian pharaohs had practiced previously, where we have marriages between brothers and sisters, uncles and nieces, or other close relatives. The other things we notice is that they're using the name Ptolemy a lot and the name Cleopatra a lot. So Cleopatra literally means glory of her father in Greek. And you may be familiar with paternal, meaning of the father. And it was quite a popular name in ancient Greece. And as we can see, the Ptolemaic family were also very, very keen on it as a title, as a name. So our Cleopatra was born in 69 BC, and her father was Ptolemy the 12th. Now, there were 5 siblings. We're not sure about the mothers of these. The 2 oldest siblings were Bernice here and Cleopatra. They may have had the same mother. And then we have 3 younger siblings from a different mother. Arsinoe, Ptolemy 13, and Ptolemy 14. This is going to get complicated. And Cleopatra grows up initially at Alexandria, where she's educated at the Library of Alexandria. Now, during this time, we have Egypt down here, Alexandria here. Most of the Mediterranean was under the control of Rome, the Roman Republic. It was a republic. What that means is that there was no emperor. It was controlled by a number of powerful families and by the Senate. And the Senate were the ones who did things like controlling money, controlling the public service, and making a lot of the civic decisions, what was going to happen to the various cities. The Roman Republic then comes under the control of a group referred to as the First Triumvirate. Wasn't what they were called at the time. We call them that because later on we're going to learn about the Second Triumvirate. They're the first one. Obviously, there are three of them. What we have is three powerful men who between them were trying to control the Roman Republic. And each of the three was bringing something different to the group. We have Julius Caesar, who was a very good public speaker. He was a very popular general. We have Marcus Licinius Crassus, who brought funds in. He brought in wealth. And the third one was Gnaeus Pompeius Magnus, who is referred to as Pompey. And he was very popular with the military. So between the three of them, they're each bringing a different thing which helps them to control the republic. Now, the Roman Senate, some of them supported the triumvirate as a group, some supported just one of them, and some opposed them because they saw them as being too powerful. What we get then is that when you have three powerful people, they're going to start squabbling. And we get a lot of fighting between Caesar and Pompey. They had both been generals who had gone out and had captured new areas for Rome, and with that came a lot of status and power. Now, in 59 BC, they started eyeing off Egypt because they wanted the grain. They wanted that food supply. Ptolemy XII does a deal with them. He pays a lot of money to them, and the Roman Republic passes a law saying they recognize him as the ruler of Egypt and will support him as that. However, this doesn't last for long. Because of that deal he did with Rome, he was really short on funds and he goes bankrupt and he becomes quite unpopular because the way that he wanted to raise more money is by increasing the taxes. At the same time, Rome takes over the island of Cyprus, which at that point was an Egyptian territory. It was an island in the middle of the Mediterranean. And this is quite unpopular, and Ptolemy ends up fleeing Egypt. He leaves and he leaves his oldest daughter, Bernice, in Egypt, and she steps in to rule in his absence. Ptolemy XII goes off to Rome and he takes his younger daughter Cleopatra with him. And the reason why he goes to Rome is that he's going to ask them for support. He's going to them because of that deal he did. He paid them money and they said they would support him as king, pharaoh. Ptolemy XII and Cleopatra stay in a villa outside Rome for about a year. But during this time, Bernice sends an embassy, a group of officials to Rome, and asks them to support her as ruler of Egypt, going, he has left, he's stuffed it up, I'm in control now. Can you give me the legitimate support? Ptolemy 12 has those officials killed, and he uses his local Roman supporters to try to cover it up. And then he goes to the Senate and says, provide me with what I need, soldiers, supplies, money, so that then I can go back to Egypt and take control back from my daughter Bernice IV. The Senate says no. It's like, we're not getting involved in this. So Ptolemy takes Cleopatra and he leaves Rome and goes to the temple of Ephesus over here. So at this point, we have Bernice in Alexandria in Egypt and Ptolemy and Cleopatra leaving Rome and going to the temple of Ephesus. This is the remains of the temple now. It must have been quite spectacular when it was still whole. Now, at this point, the fact that Rome had a lot of squabbling and fighting within the Senate and within the triumvirate means that now those separate sides are going to start playing for Egypt. Pompey, who is part of the triumvirate, he puts his backing behind Ptolemy. He wants Ptolemy back in Egypt because if he puts Ptolemy back there, he can control him indirectly. Ptolemy will owe him, and therefore Pompey will have access to the grain. So Pompey provides money for Gabinus, who was the governor of Syria, a nearby country, and he gets him to invade Egypt and return Ptolemy 12th to the throne. A little side point, in that army of Gabinus coming from Syria was a young soldier called Mark Antony. And there's a story that he sees young Cleopatra and goes, "Ooh, she's gorgeous, she's pretty hot." We're going to come back to Mark Antony in a couple of years. Gabinus returns Pompey the 12th to the throne of Egypt, and Ptolemy has his daughter Bernice executed. So he's killing his own daughter, who he left in control. She tried to take control officially. Now she is executed. So we have Ptolemy 12 has gone to Gabinus. They have now gone here and executed Bernice. However, Ptolemy 12 is not very secure on the throne. He still owes a lot of money to people in Rome. And he goes back to trying to increase the taxes to get that money. He's not very popular, and this makes him even more unpopular. However, before he can actually be thrown off again, he passes away, he dies. Probably natural causes. And he leaves his two oldest children as joint heirs. So we have Cleopatra, who at this point is around 16, and her younger brother, Ptolemy 13. He can't just leave it to Cleopatra because they're not very accepting of having a woman ruling alone. And we'd seen that that did not go well for Bernice IV. So he leaves it to Cleopatra and her younger brother. However, they are inheriting a mess. They owe money to Rome. There are Roman soldiers staying in Egypt causing problems. There's a famine and a drought. So people are not happy. Young Ptolemy 13 is only a child, and Cleopatra basically takes over. Within a few months, he's disappeared from the palace and she is the one in control. However, there are a lot of people who were supporting him. Some of them were because he's a boy. Some were because they wanted stability. Some basically thought that he was going to be an easy puppet to control. If your ruler is a child, he's very easy to influence and control. Now, Cleopatra tries to get her youngest brother to ally with her. So this is Ptolemy 14, because she sees that a female ruling alone is not getting a lot of support. So she says, well, if I have my youngest brother, I'm not a female alone, even though he was a child. This doesn't work, and we end up with Ptolemy 13 and his troops taking over control again. So Cleopatra is no longer in charge. However, we're about to start getting Rome interfering again. We remember the triumvirate. It's now down to just two. One of them, Crassus, had been killed. We're left with Julius Caesar and Pompey. Now, Julius Caesar's daughter, Julia, had been married to Pompey to basically link them together. It wasn't a love match, it was a alliance. However, she died, which meant that there was no longer that tying them together politically. And what we get now is a civil war between Pompey and Julius Caesar. Pompey is centered in Rome and he takes control there. However, Julius Caesar has been out conquering Gaul, which was now France. And he was seen as being too powerful. And he takes his army and he starts marching his army towards Rome. And there's a point where he crosses a river called the Rubicon, and crossing that river with his army was seen as he is attacking Rome itself. It is like a betrayal. He is attacking Rome with his army. How dare he do this? So he comes from Gaul, which is France, he comes down towards Rome. Now, at this point, the whole of the Roman Republic is about taking sides between these two major players. And they are about to involve Egypt. So at this point, Ptolemy 13 is in control. Cleopatra is trying to regain the throne from him. And at this point, Pompey's son, Gnaeus Pompey, arrives and he asks for Egypt to support his father in this civil war. And in return, they're going to cancel some of that debt which Egypt owes Rome. So the two siblings actually agree on something. They agree to send ships and soldiers to support Pompey. And this is the last thing they're ever going to agree on. And now we have Egypt getting involved in that civil war. What happens next? Well, Cleopatra and her brother are going to be fighting for Egypt. Pompey and Julius Caesar are fighting for control of Rome. And so now we have all of these factions who are going to be allying with each other or fighting against each other. So this is what we will look at next time.